The year was 1240, and the Mongol Empire stood as the most formidable military force the medieval world had ever witnessed. Under the leadership of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Golden Horde had carved a path of conquest across Eastern Europe that seemed unstoppable. No fortress had withstood their siege engines. No army had broken their momentum. They were transforming the political landscape of an entire continent. By this point in their westward expansion, the Mongols had already demonstrated their devastating efficiency throughout the lands of the Rus. Moscow had fallen with minimal resistance. Vladimir had been reduced to ruins. Kiev, the jewel of Eastern Slavic civilization, had been systematically destroyed in December 1240, its defenses overcome by superior Mongol siege tactics and coordination. The speed and thoroughness of these conquests sent waves of terror across Europe. What made the Mongol military machine so effective wasn't simply brutality. It was systematic excellence in virtually every aspect of warfare. Their composite bows, constructed from wood, horn, and sinew, could strike targets at ranges that surpassed European crossbows. Their cavalry operated with a level of coordination that European forces struggled to comprehend, communicating through flag signals and executing complex maneuvers that turned battlefields into precisely orchestrated killing zones. The Mongols had perfected psychological warfare to a degree that often made actual combat unnecessary. Their reputation preceded them like a weapon in itself. Cities would surrender at news of their approach, knowing that resistance meant total destruction while submission offered the possibility of survival under Mongol rule. Their intelligence networks were remarkably sophisticated, often providing them with detailed knowledge of regional defenses, political divisions, and potential weaknesses before their armies even arrived. The logistical capabilities of the Mongol war machine were equally impressive. They could sustain massive forces across thousands of miles of hostile territory, adapting their tactics to any terrain or enemy they encountered. This flexibility made them effective against the heavily armored knights of Europe, the fortified cities of Persia, and the disciplined armies of China alike. The psychological impact of the Mongol advance rippled across Eastern Europe like an earthquake. Entire populations abandoned their homes, fleeing westward ahead of the advancing horde. Trade routes that had connected civilizations for centuries were deserted. Monasteries and religious centers, believing their sacred walls offered no protection against this eastern storm, were evacuated by monks who understood that faith alone would not stop the coming devastation. But in the winter of 1240, as the Golden Horde pressed deeper into Eastern Europe, they encountered something that defied the pattern of their previous conquests. In a narrow mountain pass known as Bjorn, a small force had taken position. These weren't feudal levies fighting out of obligation, nor were they desperate peasants making a symbolic last stand. They were professional warriors with decades of combat experience, and they had chosen this ground deliberately. The Varangian Guard had once represented the elite of Byzantine military service. These northern warriors, many of Scandinavian origin, had served Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, where their reputation for loyalty and combat effectiveness had become legendary throughout the Mediterranean world. They had fought in campaigns across Syria, Armenia, and the Balkans, facing diverse enemies and adapting to different styles of warfare. But by 1240, the world that had sustained the Varangian Guard was changing. Constantinople's power was declining. The political structures that had made their services essential were evolving. Many of these warriors found themselves displaced, drifting through a world that no longer had a clear place for their particular skills. Some had sought employment with Russian princes. Others had turned to mercenary work. All of them were men caught between worlds. When the Mongol invasion swept across Eastern Europe, these displaced veterans faced the same choice as everyone else: flee westward, submit to Mongol authority, or stand and fight against overwhelming odds. For men who had built their identities around their combat prowess, surrender represented something more than tactical retreat. It represented the negation of everything they had been. Leading this unlikely defensive force was a warrior named Bjorn, sometimes called the Unbreakable in later sources. Standing nearly 7 feet tall according to contemporary descriptions, Bjorn embodied the physical and tactical capabilities that had made the Varangian Guard formidable. His military experience spanned 2 continents and dozens of major engagements, but what made Bjorn truly dangerous wasn't his physical presence or his combat record. It was his understanding of terrain and tactics. When he surveyed the Bjorn Pass, he didn't see a place to make a futile last stand. He saw a tactical opportunity that could transform numerical disadvantage into strategic advantage. The pass was narrow, barely 50 meters wide at its most confined point, with steep walls on either side that would funnel any attacking force into a restricted killing ground. The principle Bjorn understood was simple but profound. Numerical superiority only matters if those numbers can be brought to bear effectively. In open terrain, 10,000 Mongol cavalry could surround and annihilate 100 infantry within minutes. But in a narrow pass, only the front ranks could engage at any given time. The mathematical advantage that made the Mongols unstoppable on the steppes became meaningless in confined space. As word spread of the Mongol approach, approximately 100 warriors gathered at Bjorn Pass. Historical sources from the period are fragmentary, but they suggest these men understood exactly what they were choosing. They weren't fighting for territory or treasure. They were fighting because it defined who they were. For warriors who had built their entire identities around their ability to face impossible odds, this was their moment of ultimate definition. The preparations were methodical. These were experienced soldiers preparing for what they knew would be the most significant engagement of their lives. They studied every aspect of the terrain, positioned themselves with precision, and waited with the calm that comes from having already accepted the probable outcome. When Mongol scouts first reported the small force blocking the pass, the vanguard commander likely viewed it as a minor inconvenience. 100 men attempting to block the path of the most successful military force in human history seemed almost absurd from a tactical standpoint. But as the first elements of the Mongol force approached, they began to recognize that this wasn't a desperate rabble. The formation was professional. The equipment was well maintained. Most unsettling, these warriors showed none of the fear that had preceded every other Mongol victory. The first probing attack came as expected. Light cavalry, perhaps 50 riders, approached at speed to test the defensive response and look for signs of weakness. Standard Mongol procedure involved loosing volleys of arrows to break enemy morale before the main assault. When the arrow storm struck the Varangian position, the sound of steel points striking shields echoed through the pass. But when the dust settled, the defensive line remained intact. The great shields, reinforced with iron bands and held by men who had faced such attacks before, had absorbed the impact without yielding. This result challenged Mongol tactical assumptions. Their archery had broken countless formations in the past. The complete lack of visible effect suggested a level of discipline that was genuinely unusual. The main assault came with the thunder of heavy cavalry charging toward the Varangian position. But as the distance closed, the fundamental problem became apparent. The riders in the front rank found themselves compressed together, unable to maneuver, forced to approach in a narrow column rather than the devastating wide front that made cavalry charges irresistible. The collision itself was chaotic. The Mongol horses, despite their war training, instinctively balked at charging directly into an unbroken wall of steel. Their momentum faltered just as they reached the defensive line. In that moment of confusion, the shield wall exploded outward. The great Danish axes, wielded by men with decades of experience in close combat, descended in coordinated strikes that devastated the front ranks. The narrow space prevented the Mongols from using their numerical advantage while forcing them to fight exactly the kind of close-quarters battle where northern warriors excelled. The treacherous footing became a death trap for attackers trying to maintain balance. Perhaps most devastating was the psychological impact of watching elite cavalry simply be destroyed in terrain that negated all their traditional advantages. Historical records of what happened next are contested among scholars. Some sources suggest the Mongol forces eventually withdrew after suffering disproportionate casualties, deeming the pass not worth the cost of forcing it. Others indicate the defenders held their position for several days before the Mongols found alternative routes. What's clear is that this engagement represented one of the rare instances where a small force successfully denied the Mongols a tactical objective through defensive action. The broader historical significance of Bagoda Pass is debated. It didn't stop the Mongol invasion of Europe, which continued until political factors in Mongolia prompted a withdrawal. But it demonstrated that Mongol forces, while extraordinarily effective, were not invincible when faced with defenders who could exploit terrain advantages and possessed the discipline to execute defensive tactics perfectly. The story of Bagoda Pass survived in various forms through oral tradition and fragmentary written sources. It represents a moment when tactical intelligence, terrain advantage, and the willingness to accept enormous risk combined to achieve what seemed mathematically impossible. Whether exactly 100 warriors faced exactly 10,000 Mongols may never be verified with certainty. What remains is the documented instance of a small professional force successfully defying one of history's most formidable military machines, through superior positioning and unwavering discipline.